He pointed his finger at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. Right there, in the middle of one of the most expensive restaurants in Buckhead, Georgia, my own son stood up from his chair, knocked it backward against the marble floor, and aimed his index finger at my face like a weapon. His voice carried across 3 tables. "You have spent your entire life building nothing," he said, "and I am done pretending otherwise." Every fork in that room stopped moving. 50 strangers turned to look at me, an old man in a good charcoal suit, sitting very still, with a piece of salmon cooling on the plate in front of him. And the look on their faces. I knew that look. It's the look people give someone they've already decided doesn't matter. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened next, and what happened before, and what I did after, because I need you to understand something before we get to the ending. The quietest person in any room is almost never the weakest one. My name is Raymond Calloway. I am 70 years old. I spent 38 years as a civil engineer in Atlanta, Georgia. Bridges, overpasses, drainage infrastructure, the invisible bones of a city that most people drive over without ever wondering who built them. I am not a flashy man. I never have been. I wear my watch until the band cracks. I drive the same truck I bought in 2009. I live in the same brick house in Decatur I designed and helped build with my own hands in 1991, the year my son, Marcus, was born. And for a long time, I believed that quiet consistency was its own kind of love letter. I was wrong. Quiet without communication is just silence. And silence, it turns out, can be misread as surrender. I need to say this clearly at the start. I did not raise a bad person. I raised a confused one. Marcus had been marinated, since the age of 13, in a philosophy I didn't teach him that the worth of a man could be read from the surface of his life. How large his apartment, how expensive his car, how many people at the restaurant recognized his name. That philosophy had a teacher, and that teacher was not me. Her name was Beverly, my ex-wife, and the man she'd left me for 4 years earlier, a smooth-talking contractor named Clifton Marsh, who had made a career out of looking like success without being particularly burdened by it. The dinner at the restaurant had been Clifton's suggestion. Of course it had. He chose a place in Buckhead where a glass of water cost $12 and the waitstaff addressed you by your last name. The kind of place designed to make a man in an honest suit feel like he'd wandered in through the wrong door. I sat across from my son and his wife Priya, a sharp and polished woman who laughed at everything Marcus said like his words were currency. Beverly sat to my left in a dress I didn't recognize, holding her wine glass the same way Clifton held his with 2 fingers, tilted slightly, like a prop. And Clifton sat at the head of the table. Nobody had told me he was coming. Marcus announced, loudly enough for the next table to hear, that his tech startup had just closed a second round of funding, that investors were circling, that he was thinking about upgrading to a larger office in Midtown. He said all of this with his chest open and his voice big, and Priya pressed her hand to his forearm and said he deserved every bit of it, and I said nothing. Because I was the only person at that table who knew exactly where every dollar of that funding had come from. I knew the name of the firm that wrote the check. I knew the address on the paperwork. And I knew, with a certainty that made the salmon taste like cardboard, that my son had no idea. If you've ever had to sit at a table and watch someone take credit for something you built, you already know what that salmon tasted like. Beverly turned to me at some point and said, "Our son is something else, isn't he, Raymond?" The way she said it was not a question. It was a measuring tape. She ran it from the top of my head to the bottom of my honest suit and found me 12 inches short. I nodded. I let it pass. Then Clifton leaned forward in that practiced way he had: deep voice, warm smile, the performance of a man who had rehearsed sincerity, and said that I seemed like a good man, a solid man, but that the world had changed. He said men who built things for other people their whole lives never quite made the leap to building for themselves. He said there was a kind of man who just never caught fire. And Marcus nodded along like he was hearing the gospel. "Dad's always been more of a safety guy," he said. "Nothing wrong with it. Just not everyone's built for the big game." Safety. That was this month's word. Last time it had been careful. Before that, risk-averse. The vocabulary shifted every few months. The verdict never did. And then dessert arrived. And Clifton made a show of handling the check before it even landed on the table, his eyes sliding toward me as he did it, making sure I registered the gesture. One more performance. One more small, deliberate stone dropped into the silence I kept. And that was when the thread finally gave way. Marcus stood up fast, and his chair scraped the floor hard enough to make people flinch. He looked from Clifton to me, and in that beautiful, terrible room full of strangers, he said it. "That's the whole difference right there, Dad. You spent 40 years working on other people's things, and you've got a house in Decatur and a truck from 2009 to show for it. Clifton built something. He built a life. You." He exhaled through his nose. "You're still the same man you were when I was a kid." And I spent a long time being embarrassed by that. Priya didn't try to hide her smile. Beverly looked down at the white tablecloth like it had said something interesting. And Clifton raised his wine glass just slightly, not a toast, not quite, just a small acknowledgement of a battle won. I sat completely still. I did not argue, I did not cry, I did not stand up and shout the truth across that restaurant. I looked at my son for a long moment, and somewhere behind the expensive clothes and the borrowed philosophy, I caught a flicker of something, the 9-year-old boy who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of that 2009 truck on the way home from Braves games. That flicker lasted about half a second. Then it was gone, buried under whatever it had been replaced with. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage, not grief. Just a cold, clarifying calm. The kind an engineer feels when he looks at a structure and realizes, without drama, that it is no longer sound. I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate. I stood. My chair made no sound at all. I looked at each of them, Beverly, Clifton, Marcus, Priya, and then I walked out of that restaurant. The heavy glass door closed behind me without a slam. Just a soft, definitive click. I hailed nothing. I walked. The glittering streets of Buckhead gave way to quieter neighborhoods, and then to the Decatur block I'd lived on for 33 years. The old oak in my front yard. The brick house I drew the plans for myself, before Marcus was born, while Beverly was still somebody I understood. Inside, everything was in its place. I didn't pour a drink. I didn't turn on the television. I went directly to my study, a small room at the back of the house, bookshelves, floor to ceiling, blueprints on the walls, a photograph of Marcus on the corner of the desk, 7 years old, wearing a plastic hard hat 3 sizes too big, perched on my shoulders at a job site, grinning with every tooth in his head. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Where did I lose that boy? Not a sharp question. A dull, tired ache that had been accumulating for years. Water, damn it, tonight was the night for something else. I want to be honest with you here. I've thought about this moment 100 times since. And I am still not entirely certain that what I did next was purely about tough love. Some part of it was, a real part. But I would be lying if I said there wasn't a quieter part, a slower part, that simply wanted my son to understand what he had said. Not feel bad, understand. There's a difference. One is punishment. The other is education. I told myself I was choosing education. I still believe that. Mostly. I opened my old desktop computer. I typed a long password. 22 characters. Mixed. The kind you build when you have something worth protecting. And a folder structure appeared that held, in quiet and unremarkable digital form, the entire invisible architecture of my son's life. Let me explain. 4 years earlier, Marcus had come to me with a pitch for a software company. The idea wasn't bad, smarter logistics routing for mid-sized distributors. But the business plan was a fantasy document built on enthusiasm and zero capital discipline. He needed $2 million to get started. And I knew with the same certainty an engineer knows when a load calculation is wrong, that if I handed my son $2 million, he would learn nothing. He would burn through it in 18 months and come back having absorbed only the lesson that money appears when you need it. That is not a lesson. That is a drug. So I told him my savings were locked in retirement instruments I couldn't touch without penalty. And Marcus shook his head and called me old-fashioned and left. And then I picked up the phone and called the one person I trusted completely. A corporate attorney named Delia Ashworth. The sharpest mind I have ever met. a woman who had helped me structure real estate investments for 12 years and who I trusted with everything that mattered. Together, Delia and I built something. We set up a silent trust, funded with $2 million of my own money, registered in Delaware. We created a shell venture capital firm, a real-looking firm with a real-looking website and a retired finance professor as its friendly public face. And then we waited. And when Marcus pitched his idea to the investing community, that firm found him. He flew up to their office, gave his presentation, and walked out with a check. He never once wondered why it had been so easy. He had always believed, somewhere deep down, that the world was waiting to recognize his talent. So when it did, it felt like confirmation, not coincidence. The firm owned 60% of his company through the anonymous trust. Marcus held 20% as CEO, which meant in the language of corporate reality that he was his company's highest paid employee. He had never owned it, not for a single day. Then there was the car, a luxury sedan Marcus insisted he needed for client meetings. His personal credit history was thin, so the company had leased it, or so he believed. In reality, the lease ran through one of my holding companies, dressed as a fleet management vendor. The contract was explicit. The moment he lost qualifying employment status, the vehicle returned. Marcus had signed without reading past page 2. He rarely read past page 2. And then the apartment. This one is harder to explain without sounding calculated. After Beverly left, she had become, quite suddenly, a woman obsessed with surfaces. She filled Marcus's head with the idea that your address announced your character. Marcus and Priya had spent months hunting for the right place, something that would signal arrival. They found a penthouse in a restored pre-war building in Midtown. Marcus called me and asked for help with the deposit. I said no. I told him it was irresponsible to stretch so far beyond his means. What I did not say was that I had purchased that entire building 3 years before Beverly left, as an undervalued asset in a gentrifying corridor. When Marcus applied for the penthouse, my property managers offered him an incentive lease, nearly zero rent, in exchange for the prestige of a young tech CEO as their anchor tenant. Marcus told everyone about it for weeks. He never read the fine print. The fine print said the arrangement was contingent on his continued qualifying employment, terminable with 72 hours notice. So, there it was. His company, his car, his home, 3 pillars of his entire identity. Every one of them a structure I had designed, funded, and quietly owned. He was not a self-made man. He was a son whose father had been too afraid to let him fail. I need to pause here, because I know how this sounds. And I want you to sit with me for a moment. Not to excuse what I did, but to understand the weight of it. Because I had not built all of this to control my son. I had built it because I loved him and didn't know any other language. I thought if I kept the scaffolding up long enough, he would eventually find his footing inside it. I had been patient for 4 years, and in return, I had been publicly called a failure, while the man, my ex-wife, chose a man whose entire business was a single consulting contract paid for by money that had originally been mine, raised a wine glass in my direction. The patience was over. I opened an encrypted email and wrote 2 words to Delia Ashworth: begin dissolution. Then I hit send. A soft sound in a silent room. And I sat back, and for the first time in years, I felt no anxiety. Just the steady, cold composure of a man who has run the numbers and knows how the structure will fall. I honestly don't know if I could have done it differently, even knowing what I know now. You reach a point where protecting someone from the truth becomes its own kind of cruelty. The kindest thing a parent can do is eventually let their child carry their own weight, even if the weight breaks them first. Even if it breaks you to watch. Monday morning I sat on my back porch with black coffee and the newspaper, and across town, Marcus walked into his parking garage in a $3,000 suit and found a tow truck parked behind his car. He apparently laughed at first, told the driver to move. The driver showed him a work order, a holding company Marcus had never heard of. He called the leasing number 3 times, each call more frantic than the last. A polite woman confirmed the termination. The vehicle's legal owner had exercised their contractual right. There was no recourse. Marcus stood in that garage and watched the front end of his car lifted off the ground, watched it dragged up the ramp, heard the rear wheels scrape along the concrete, a sound he would later describe as the worst sound he'd ever heard. And then there was an empty space where his identity used to park. The first wall had come down. Tuesday was quieter, in its way, which made it worse. Marcus arrived at his office late, having taken a rideshare he considered beneath him. He stopped at the lobby cafe to order the usual round for his executive team. It was his ritual, a small daily performance of generosity. He handed the barista his corporate card. Declined. He tried again. Declined. There were 4 people behind him in line. He paid in cash, barely, and took the elevator up to his corner office with the midtown skyline behind him, and opened the company's financial platform. His login credentials returned one message: access denied. He called the firm's bank contact. He called his CFO. He called 3 board members he'd always believed were mere formalities. No one answered. An email arrived from the majority shareholders informing him that all executive account access had been suspended pending a comprehensive audit. Effective immediately. He sat in his glass office, 40 floors above Atlanta, and felt the floor tilt. And then his phone rang. It was Clifton, the winner, the role model, the man with the practiced wine glass tilt. But the voice on the phone was not smooth and deep and authoritative. It was high and fast and raw with panic. Clifton's monthly consulting fee, a fee Marcus had always assumed was standard advisory compensation, hadn't deposited. It was 2 days late. He had payments due: the mortgage on a lake house in Cherokee County, the lease on Beverly's car. He needed Marcus to sort it out immediately. He said, "This is unacceptable." He said, "This is not how you run a company." And Marcus, for the very first time, heard the sound underneath Clifton's performance. Not confidence, fear, genuine, unmistakable fear. And something shifted in Marcus's chest that he couldn't name yet. He would name it by Wednesday. Wednesday evening, Priya was home when Marcus returned. She met him at the door in tears. Her personal credit card, the one he maintained, had been declined at the salon. In front of her friends, she was still shaking. And before Marcus could form a response, there was a knock at the door. A man in a gray suit, holding a manila envelope. He introduced himself as the new property manager, stepped inside with the quiet authority of someone who belonged there, looked around at the designer furniture and the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of Midtown sparkling 40 floors below, and then handed my son a formal notice of lease termination. Marcus told him there had to be a mistake. The manager pointed to the clause, slowly, calmly, like a teacher with a struggling student. The incentive lease. Contingent on qualifying employment. Void as of the audit notification. 72 hours to vacate. He thanked them for their time and walked out without hurrying. And Priya collapsed. Not dramatically. She just deflated, right there in the middle of that beautiful apartment, and made a sound Marcus had never heard from her, a low, wrecked moan. And then she started talking very fast about whose fault this was, and what she was supposed to tell her parents, and whether any of this had ever been real. Marcus stood in the center of the room holding the eviction notice, and his eyes moved to the fine print at the bottom, a company name he didn't recognize. Different from the car, different from the shareholders, but the same handwriting, figuratively speaking, the same quiet, methodical signature underneath all of it. It wasn't bad luck. It was architecture. And he had only ever known one architect. His hands were shaking when he dialed my number. I let it ring twice. When I answered, I said nothing. Just waited. And Marcus's voice came through the line, jagged and raw. "You did this. All of it. The car, the company, the apartment. That was you. It wasn't a question." And I held the phone and listened to the silence between his words, and I felt not victory, not satisfaction, something quieter, the feeling of a man who has finally told the truth after years of silence. "Come to the house," I said. "We need to talk." He arrived in 22 minutes in a rideshare. I didn't go to the door. I waited in the study. I let the doorbell ring twice, then spoke through the intercom. I told him to come in. He stormed down the hallway and appeared in the doorway of my study, the room he had always called my boring old hobby space, and I watched him look around it for the first time with new eyes. The blueprints on the walls, the folders, the monitor, the photograph of him at 7 years old, in the hard hat, grinning. I sat behind the oak desk and did not stand up, did not raise my voice. I folded my hands and waited. "How could you?" he said. "How could you do this to your own son? I worked for everything I had. I built it." That last sentence, "I built it," hung between us like smoke, and I gestured to the chair across from me, the simple wooden chair, and I told him to sit down, that the yelling part was finished, that it was time to listen. He sat. The anger was still on his face, but underneath it now was something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The look of a man who has just realized the map he's been using might be wrong. I turned the monitor toward him. I opened the file on the company first. I walked him through the Delaware Trust, the shell firm, the 60% controlling stake. I showed him the incorporation papers, my name, his name. "The percentages," I said, quietly. "You are your company's highest paid employee, Marcus. The board of directors you've never met is me." He shook his head slowly. He said that wasn't possible. He said he had pitched that firm, he had won that funding, and I didn't argue. I just moved to the next folder. The car lease. The holding company's name. The clause, clear as a blueprint. "You were permitted to use that car," I said. When the permission no longer made sense, it was revoked. He stared at the screen. Then the apartment building, the deed, my name, the purchase date, 3 years before his application. "You weren't a prestige tenant," I said, and I kept my voice gentle because gentleness, right now, was the most devastating thing I had. "You were my son, living rent-free in my building. And your behavior made that arrangement untenable." The blood left his face in a single motion, like a tide going out. But I wasn't finished. I told him there was one more thing. One more piece he needed to see. I opened the final folder. A contract. Clifton Marsh Consulting. $50,000 a month from Marcus's company, my company, technically direct to Clifton's business account. I asked Marcus, very quietly, if he had ever wondered why Clifton never talked about other clients. Why his advice always seemed to be available at any hour. Why his only visible business activity seemed to be mentoring Marcus. "That $50,000 a month," I said, "is Clifton's only income. Your company is his only client. Your company is funded entirely by my trust." Which means Marcus, the life Clifton built, the house your mother lives in, her car, their vacations, the restaurants, all of it flows from the very man you stood up and called a loser. I let that sentence land. I didn't help him absorb it. I just watched. Marcus made a sound I cannot fully describe, something between a word and a breath. He actually leaned back from the desk, physically recoiled, as if the air in the room had changed temperature. The winner his mother had chosen over me. The man who had handed him a vocabulary of contempt. The role model he'd thanked for, finally teaching him what a real man looked like. He had been on my payroll the entire time. Not because I wanted control, because his livelihood, without my invisible infrastructure, simply did not exist. The whole architecture of Marcus's world, every person in it he had been taught to admire, every measure of success he had accepted as his own, had been quietly built and funded by the dusty old man in the honest charcoal suit. He sat in that chair for a long time, and the anger left him completely, not in a rush. The way light leaves a room at the end of the day, slowly, and then all at once. And I want you to hold this moment with me, because this is the part of the story that I think about most. Not the restaurant, not the tow truck, not even the eviction notice. This moment, my son, sitting in that wooden chair in my study, looking at his own life laid out in folders on a screen, understanding for the first time that the story he had been telling himself was not true. I did not feel powerful. I felt something much more complicated than power. I felt the grief of a man who realizes that the thing he thought was love, the protecting, the funding, the invisible scaffolding, had actually been a way of keeping his son from ever having to be strong. I had built a shelter so complete that it had become a room with no windows and no doors. Money without wisdom is not a gift. It is a beautiful trap, and I had laid it with the best intentions I had. I leaned back in my chair. I told Marcus that I had not taken anything from him. I had taken back what was mine, And then I told him what came next. Get a job. Any job. Not a CEO title. Not a startup. A job. Pay rent on something you can actually afford. Build something with your own effort and your own sweat and your own ingenuity. Learn what a dollar feels like when you earned it with your body. And when he had done that, not when I decided he had done enough, but when he could look me in the eye and honestly say he understood the difference between performing success and building it, we would talk about the trust again. I stood up, my knees protesting the way they always do now, and I walked out of the study. I left him alone with the folders, and I did not look back. The weeks that followed were the quietest I have known in many years. I ate dinner at my own pace. I pruned the rose bushes along the back fence. I started a novel I'd been meaning to read for a decade. The silence that settled over the house was not lonely. It was the silence of a man who has finally stopped holding his breath. One warm evening I was sitting on the back porch with iced tea when my phone rang. Beverly. I looked at the name for a long moment before answering. She was in full panic. Clifton's contract was gone. The bank was moving on the lake house. The car lease was being called. The country club membership had lapsed. And it was, she told me, all my fault. I had done this out of jealousy, out of cruelty. After everything she had given me, after everything they had shared, she demanded, and I want to be precise about this word, because she did not request. She demanded that I restore what she called their stability. There was no apology for the dinner, no concern for Marcus, no acknowledgement of what had been said to me in that restaurant. Just a woman who had underestimated a quiet man for a very long time, now discovering what that quiet man had been capable of all along. I let her finish. I listened to the silence between her words. I watched a firefly blink twice at the edge of the yard. And then I said very simply, and with no anger and no satisfaction and no performance of any kind, Beverly, that is no longer my concern. And I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the arm of the chair, and the slow rocking motion resumed. And the firefly blinked again, indifferent and perfect. Here is what this whole long year taught me, and I say this not as a man who won, but as a man who finally woke up. If someone in your life has learned to mistake your patience for passivity, your silence for surrender, your consistency for limitation, that is not a reflection of your value. That is a reflection of their blindness. The most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It's the quiet one who has been watching long enough to understand exactly how everything is connected. And the saddest truth I carry from all of this is not about Marcus, not about Beverly, not even about Clifton. It's this. The most loving thing I ever could have done for my son was to let him struggle 20 years earlier. To say no the first time he needed rescuing. To let him feel what it was like to carry his own weight. So that when success came and I believed it would have come, it would have belonged to him, genuinely, in a way nothing I quietly funded ever could. If you have ever loved someone so much that you protected them from the very experiences that would have made them strong, you understand the weight I carried out of that study. It is not a light thing to realize. It does not resolve cleanly. You sit with it. You let it teach you something. And then, slowly, you move forward. I still have the photograph of Marcus in the hard hat on my desk. I haven't moved it. I don't intend to. That boy is still in there somewhere, and I am still his father. Whatever comes next, that doesn't change. But what comes next has to be built by him, on real ground, with real effort, with skin in the game that is actually, genuinely his. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I mean this sincerely. I'm not going through the motions here. Do you think I went too far? Leave a comment with the number 1 if you believe what I did was justified, that stripping away the illusion was the only way to give my son a real foundation. Leave a number 2 if you think I crossed a line somewhere, that a father who truly loved his son wouldn't have engineered the collapse. He would have found another way. Or leave a number 3 if you think the real responsibility lies with Beverly and Clifton, that my son was the product they built and the blame belongs upstream. Tell me where in the world you're watching from right now and what time it is there. I am genuinely, consistently amazed at how far a story like this can travel. And if you have ever been underestimated by someone who had absolutely no idea what you were holding in reserve, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe. We tell stories here about quiet people and the moments when the truth finally catches up to the performance. I'd love to have you here for the next one. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It means more than you know. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta, Georgia to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.